This is being made with the Seek the Old Paths TV program. Thank you so much for being with us. You know, this lesson, this is lesson 15. And I think it is a great example of why it's really a good thing to have our study guide. Now, I say our study guide. It's put out by Bob and Sandra Waldron. The information will be on your screen from time to time, how you can order your own copy if you'd like to have it. But this lesson is called Years of Chaos. Years of Chaos. And what it's about is it's about that terrible time of persecution for Christians. It helps us to better understand some of the things like in 1 Peter, what Peter was talking about with their persecution, or the things in the book of Revelation as it talked about the severe persecution that Christians would be undergoing during the time of the Roman Empire. And so we're going to look into that. And so this is going to be extra biblical, you might say. It's the background information for the epistles that we will look at next. We've just finished Hebrews, and now, Lord willing, we'll pick up after 2 or 3 lessons on this history. Then we'll pick up with our study and keep on going all the way from 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Jude, Revelation, all the way through. And so I appreciate that you're with us, and I hope this will be interesting. This may be information that you've not heard before. This is when we get really serious into our Bible study, and we want to know the background of various things. And so we'll talk about the decade of the 60s. Now, you know, in our day and time, the decade of the 60s, well, that was a turbulent time in the 1960s. So I want to tell you, in the AD 60s, it was a turbulent time. Well, saints were just busy. The gospel is being spread. It started at Jerusalem, and it goes from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the world as the Lord wanted it to do. We're going to kind of recap some things now. And so we have that by AD 60, Paul's 3 missionary journeys were over. He has brought gifts as he collected money on some of those journeys, brought the money back to help the needy saints in Jerusalem. He's going to be arrested by the Jews, and many of the Jews, they didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, and then you had those Jewish people who did believe in Jesus, didn't think the Gentiles ought to have a part in that salvation. He's going to be in prison in Caesarea, which is above Jerusalem. He's going to be in prison in Caesarea for over a year, and then he's going to appeal to Caesar, and then on the way to Rome to face trial in Caesar's court, Emperor Caesar, then he's going to be shipwrecked. And he doesn't even reach Rome until about AD 61. Well, then, toward the close of his 2-year imprisonment in Rome, when he finally does get there, then he's going to write 4 letters. He's going to write Ephesians and Colossians and Philippians and Philemon, and those are not in the order as in our Bibles. Those are in what is thought to be chronological order. These are known as the prison epistles. And then in about AD 33, he's going to be released. And now Paul doesn't stop there. He's not intimidated by the fact he was in prison. And so in the next year, he's going to several places that we see indications of in various epistles that he will write after his release from prison. In fact, he writes Titus, he writes 1 Timothy, and now 2 Timothy he will write shortly before his death, somewhere around AD 65, AD 66. Now Luke, he accompanies Paul on a good bit of his journey, not with him all the time, but he is with Paul on that last trip to Jerusalem, and 2 years later when he travels to Rome. Now during this time he wrote the Gospel of Luke. Sometime around AD 58, AD 60, probably started writing the book of Acts somewhere at that time, and then finished it during the winter and early spring as he made his way to Rome. Except, of course, for the very last part of the book of Acts, because it talks about Paul being there in prison, and that he would be there 2 more years before his hearing. Now, Dating of the book of Acts, probably around AD 60, AD 61. Now, Matthew and Mark are written somewhere around this time. So we just, we just look at our Bibles and we think, well, we've got it all. And thankfully we do, but they didn't. The Bible was still being written. The New Testament was still unfolding as far as the writing. Now, we're still in the days of the New Testament. But the writing of the New Testament is really going in earnest around this time. Now, James, he continued his work among the Jews in Jerusalem. This is James, of the apostles, James and John. He knew all of the conflicts between the Christians and the unbelieving Jews of Judea. He likely wrote the book of James. No, let me back up. This is James, the Lord's brother. I misspoke. He likely wrote the book of James in the early years of the 60s. After Paul escaped the clutches of the Jews, they turned their hatred against James and murdered him in AD 62. It's difficult years. Persecution came from the Jews. It's not from the Roman government yet. It's from the Jews. Now, there's some spotty trouble there. But dating the book of Hebrews is difficult. We talked about that previously. They are under pressure to return to Judaism. Not just to, be a Christian, but also be a Jew. No, don't be a Christian at all. Probably written before the Jewish wars that started in AD 66. See, we have persecution against the Christians starting up. A little bit later, that's still going on, but a little later, the Jews keep revolting against Rome, and the Romans come to stop them from their revolts. And that started about AD 66. Now, Hebrews could have been written after Nero's persecution began. This would place additional pressure on the Christians. And if so, it dates the book somewhere between 64 to 66. Peter, now, he worked in Jerusalem for a long time after the other apostles were scattered to other places. And we don't know much about what Peter did after he left Jerusalem. He addressed his first letter to the brethren in the northern province of Asia Minor. So we have to assume he did some work there. This was much further north than Paul had visited. Paul at one time wanted to go further north, but the Holy Spirit told him no. Maybe it was because Peter was there. I don't know. That's just some speculation. He speaks of widespread persecution in the writing of 1 Peter, as we mentioned before. He is urging them, just be steadfast, be faithful. And although the Jews had persecuted Christians for 30 years, they couldn't do the widespread persecution. They had places like Cappadocia and Pontus and Bithynia, but they couldn't do it empire-wide, you might say. Therefore, Peter's writings are dated after the beginning of the Roman persecution in AD 64, because Peter talks a lot about persecution there in 1 Peter. Now, as turbulent as the 60s were, the early 60s, it proved to be the calm before the storm. The Jews, they had Paul put in prison. They would follow him around, cause him trouble. Earlier than putting Paul in prison, they had Peter and John arrested. They had all the apostles arrested. Paul himself caused such havoc against the church that it scattered the disciples everywhere from Jerusalem. And so there were times of persecution, but it was nothing like what's about to happen. Because, see, those were struggles between Jews and Christians. But by the spring of 64, an enormous cloud of trouble was about to descend upon the Christians. See, until now, the Roman officials, they didn't pay much attention to Christianity. And in fact, in Acts chapter 18, when Paul was at Corinth, they tried to drag him before the court, and they wouldn't even hear it. They run him out. It was the Romans who rescued Paul from the Jews in Acts chapter 21 when they were about to tear him apart because they were accusing him of violating and desecrating the temple, which, of course, he had not done. But now the Roman government, it's about to turn the spotlight and its cruelty on the saints. These, if you're a Christian, these are our brothers and sisters. And so what's going to happen is Nero, the Roman Emperor Nero, he reigns from AD 54 to AD 68. We're talking a lot about the decade of the 60s, the AD 60s. It was Nero who determined Paul's fate and his first imprisonment in Rome. But see, the persecution had not started yet, so Paul was released at that time. They thought of Christianity as just a branch of Judaism, and that's easy to understand why they would think that. But July the 19th, AD 64, there was a terrible fire that occurred in Rome. In fact, out of the 14 districts that Rome was divided into, 10 of them were destroyed by fire. Not a lot of fire codes in place. Buildings were built kind of close together, a lot of wooden structures, and it just jumped from structure to structure. A lot of people were thinking Nero did that. Now, I don't know why they thought that, but that was the rumor that was going around. And Christians proved to be somebody Nero could use to divert attention from himself. And so they became the scapegoats. Let's just blame those old Christians. Christians, unfortunately, were not well liked. They were not understood. They didn't worship the pagan gods. They did not worship the emperor. They didn't do any of that. And so they were hated, similar to the Jews. But the Jews were even more tolerated at that point than the Christians. Well, Tacitus goes on to describe the terrible persecution upon the Christians. Now, these next a couple of slides I'm going to show you are quotes from the historian Tacitus. And so Tacitus, he's no friend of the Christians, but neither does he ignore maybe some hypocrisy that goes into the persecuting of Christians. And so the rumors of the fire being started, they are just going on. So Nero fabricated these scapegoats. Here's what Tacitus says. He punished the notoriously depraved Christians for their antisocial tendencies. See, Christians didn't mix and mingle and do all the things that the other pagans would take part in. He says the originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius's reign by Pontius Pilate. Now, side note, that is an extra biblical source and evidence that yes, Jesus Christ lived and he was executed by Pontius Pilate. In fact, that's the only reference to Pontius Pilate. The deadly superstitions broke out afresh, he says, even to Rome. They thought they had stopped it, he's saying, when they executed the originator of it, Christ. But it broke out again and made its way to Rome. And so he says Christians were arrested. Their deaths, he said, were farcical, meaning they were dressed in wild animal skins. They were torn to pieces by dogs. Some were crucified. Some were made into human torches to be lit after dark to light up Nero's gardens. Nero, well, he liked to. He provided his garden for this spectacle. He would mingle with the crowd. He would dress up like a charioteer and ride around in a chariot, just making mockery out of the death of innocent people. Tacitus says, despite their guilt as Christians and the ruthless punishment it deserved, the victims were pitied. It was felt that this was about one man's brutality. So even the people who did not have a favorable opinion of this upstart group known as Christians, they were seeing through what Nero was doing. And this would help turn the tide and help people at least have some degree of sympathy for Christians. Now, it was not unheard of for this kind of behavior from Nero. It kind of fit a pattern. he was a very cruel and vindictive ruler. It got worse as it went. See, thankfully for Paul, during his first imprisonment, he was able to be released because Nero had not gotten quite as bad as he would get. Nero had no respect for life. Cruel deaths were counted as sport for the multitudes. Eusebius, who was an early church historian, he refers to thousands of Romans Nero killed before he ever persecuted Christians. So again, this is not out of character for Nero at all. Now, we don't know how many Christians might have been killed at that time. Paul and Peter, sadly, were two of the many who lost their lives during Nero's initial wave of persecution. Many others feared for their life. Instead of destroying the church, though, you know what happened? Made it stronger. Made it stronger. Sometimes persecution does that. Sometimes war does that. Remember after 9/11, what happened to church attendance across this country? It went up. People were realizing this life is fragile. I need somebody beside myself, beyond myself. And so people were turned, at least for a time, back to more of a spiritual mindset. And so with the persecution of Christians, it actually served to strengthen the church. Now, Nero's persecution was the first one, brought against the church by the Roman government. That's where it started on an empire-wide basis. Christians, they've been persecuted by Jews. That started right off the bat. Jesus himself killed by the Jews. Peter and John put in prison by the Jews, and so on. And then as Paul would travel, there'd be various disputes between Paul and the Jews, various cities, but not by the government itself. And so it would seem that the persecution would be worse in some places than others. The early church fathers really don't indicate that it was widespread. Early church fathers would be those who wrote after the inspired writers. People who wrote after the New Testament was written. So you had leaders in the church, and they wrote letters to their churches, to other churches, to each other, and we have many of those recordings. And so in 1 Peter, persecution in the provinces of northern Asia Minor are talked about. And so it seems that some of the provincial governors kind of followed the lead of Nero, and they were worse about persecuting Christians than others. We have references like 1 Peter 1, verse 1, and in chapter 4, verse 12, and so on, about persecuting the Christians. Can you imagine living during that time? Can you imagine the trauma of not knowing if somebody was going to come beat your door down, drag you off? Paul did that. When Paul was known as Saul, before he was converted, he would do those kind of things to Christians. But he was one man. Can you imagine when the entire Roman government puts their weight behind the persecution? Many Christians died. There were some prominent people killed. It was a horrifying memory in the history of the church. Then Nero dies. And when Nero dies, the persecution died with him. In fact, he died in AD 68 by his own hand. He was helped by a former slave named Epaphroditus. Suicide was not uncommon in that day and time. They did not want to fall into the hands of their enemies, and they'd often take their own lives to keep from being tortured by their enemy. This phase of persecution by Rome lasted less than 4 years. It went from AD 64 to AD 68. But see, Nero, his goal was, he wasn't trying to stamp out Christianity. He just needed a scapegoat to blame somebody for the fires that almost burned Rome completely up. Later, the persecution will have the goal of eradicating Christianity, and it's going to be far worse than what we've seen so far. But the brutality and deaths that resulted from the Jewish wars coming up now would make the persecution of the saints seem small, because we're about to get into the Jewish wars in AD 66. Now, it's going to be far worse because it's going to be concentrated. It's going to be focused on Jerusalem and some of the surrounding area, but mostly Jerusalem. Josephus was a Jewish historian, and he has provided us with the largest amount of information we have about this terribly brutal crackdown on the revolt that the Jews kept making against the Roman government. Josephus, a little bit about him as a Jew. He was a Jew, and he played an active role in these wars. And so he could tell, firsthand, here's what happened. Tacitus and Eusebius, both historians, also provide some information, but they mostly are referring back to Josephus. Josephus, interestingly, was of priestly descent. His family, in fact, was part of the 24 courses of priests. Now, that go back to the Old Testament. That was just a very influential group of priests. He was descended from Asmoneus, from whom the Maccabean ruling house was named. The Maccabeans. We have two writings of secular history, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, that talk about that family. He was born in the first year of Caius Caesar, or Caligula, in AD 37. And so he was only 8 years after Jesus had returned to heaven and the church began. So Josephus was growing up in the very early days of the church. Now, he studies, Josephus, evidently a very intelligent man. And so he's studying about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes. These were all Jewish sects, and he decided he'd be a Pharisee. Now, Paul, the Apostle Paul, he was a Pharisee. He said he was of the strictest sect of the Jews, the Pharisees, and that's what Josephus decided he would lean toward. By the time he was an adult, it had gotten very bad in Judea. And he was trying to avoid this confrontation. In the war, he served as a military leader in Galilee. He was fighting in the army of the Jews against the Romans to begin with. He was captured in battle, though, with the forces of Vespasian. Vespasian was the leader of the Roman army. And seeing the folly of trying to fight the Roman Empire, he tried to convince his people to lay down their arms. Well, that made him to fall in favor with the Romans. As you read his writings, you can see that just sheer anguish over the fate of his people. He was concerned about his people. Well, the Romans now, they engaged in the siege of Jerusalem, and they appreciated his help. Jesus talked about that. Don't have it on the screen, but Jesus talked about how they were going to lay a siege around Jerusalem and how it'd be destroyed. Well, again, back to Josephus. The Romans, they liked Josephus. They didn't like him personally, but they appreciated his help. He was somebody they could use. Vespasian, the Roman general, he in fact greatly rewarded him. And then Titus, who was the son of Vespasian, he comes back with an army and he finishes the conquest of Jerusalem, and he rewards Josephus for his help. And in fact, Josephus is given lands there in Judea, but the Jews didn't like him. He was a turncoat in their minds. And he did. He went from fighting with the Jews to helping the Romans. And so he moved to Rome. But the Romans, they didn't like him either. He was just kind of running out of places to be. Well, the Jews resented the Romans. From the first time they entered Jerusalem in 63 BC. So we've gone right at 100 years now with the Romans in Jerusalem, and they never accepted it. The Romans considered this as just some troublemakers. It's a hot spot for them, but they needed it. But the Romans didn't understand. Here's a people who only worship one God. Everybody else worships many gods. They had a law that was just different. The old law was different, which means it's unique, which lends to say, yeah, that's because it's from God. The Romans wanted to control the whole Mediterranean Sea, and so they needed this little tiny strip of land. If you looked at a map, you'd see the Mediterranean Sea. It's kind of it's not a square, but it's got rounded edges. But at the very east end of it, as you look down and zoom, you'd have to kind of zoom in, and there's Israel. And you'd come from Syria, and you'd have to go through Israel, and then you go around to Egypt. But at the east of Israel was the country of Parthia. And it would help the Romans to have that buffer, because they wanted to control the Mediterranean Sea, so they needed Israel, that little strip of land they occupied, so they could better control the Parthians, who they never could completely conquer. In spite of his wickedness, Herod the Great helped relationships between the Romans and the Jews during his lifetime. Herod the Great was no nice fellow, but he did do some things that helped. But for the Jews, he convinced the Romans to let the Jews, keep their law. Let them worship God like they believed they should. And so they did. He said, otherwise they're just going to continue to be a problem for you. And that worked for a while. But then Herod dies. And things just didn't get any better. Got worse. Pilate comes along, and he's the one that knew Jesus was innocent. But he gives in to the Jews' demand because he didn't want any trouble from them either. He didn't want any more riots. And his job was to keep the peace. And so if trouble breaks out again from these stubborn Jews, he feared he could lose his job. But the years between the establishment of the church in AD 29 and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, as you look at those, there's just increasing tension. And there's turmoil in Palestine, or the land of the Jews. A spirit of rebellion just permeated Jewish society. See, they were driven in a misguided way by their faith and their belief that as long as the temple was there, God was there. As long as God was there, they couldn't be conquered. They had the same belief before the Babylonians destroyed the temple, 1,000 years or so earlier. Well, not 1,000 years, but several hundred years earlier. Eleazar, an arch robber, he ravaged the country for 20 years. He was stirring up trouble. Sicarii slew men in the daytime in the midst of the city. They were like a terrorist group. They'd come through the crowd and they find their enemies, and they had these daggers they kept hidden. They'd just walk up, stab somebody, and just keep walking. And so they were stirring up turmoil. Josephus named several other parties that were just causing trouble. It's constant. And thus the flame was every day more and more blown up till it came to direct war, Josephus said. Well, then you had the governors of Judea. You had Pilate, remember, and then you had Felix, and then you had Festus. Now, the Apostle Paul dealt with both of these during the time he was in prison. Well, they're going to do some things good, some things not good. Festus stopped most of the robbery, and he destroyed many of the guilty, but then he was followed by Albinus, and Albinus he became one of the thieves himself. He stole, he plundered, he greatly increased the taxes, he released wrongdoers in return for bribes, he was guilty of sedition and anarchy, and so all of that just stirred the pot even more. And so the governors will continue to change, some better or worse than others. You had Gessius Florus followed Albinus, and he made Albinus look good, and that had to really be bad. So far that he almost single-handedly started the Jewish wars. Whole cities were brought to ruins, and many people would just flee the country to get away. And so it was just getting worse and worse and worse until it's going to be full-blown war. We're going to stop here. Our time has quickly gotten away. This is a fascinating, though sad, time of history. Thank you for joining us. Let's learn this background information, and then we'll get back to our study of the biblical text. Thank you for being with us. As always, let's seek the old past.
I've been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. I've been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb.